A comment that I've seen on a lot of my videos recently is, didn't the gospel writers know Jesus' friends and family? Didn't they get their anecdotes and their stories about Jesus to write their gospels? And the answer is no, definitely not. 1,000% not. And I can prove it. The oldest gospel in the New Testament was the Gospel of Mark. At its earliest, it was written around 70 CE. So how do we know that that's the earliest? Because of the Markan Apocalypse, where Jesus tells the disciples that the temple will be destroyed and not one stone shall be left on top of another. The problem with prophecy is that prophecies are always written after the events that they purport to describe have already happened. Hey, don't get mad at me. I don't make up the rules. This is just how things work. So if 70 CE is the earliest date for Mark, what's the latest possible composition date? That's really anybody's guess. Our earliest manuscripts of Mark go back to about the mid-3rd century, but some scholars date its composition as late as 140 CE. And if that were accurate, our usual dating of Matthew and Luke to about 10 to 20 years after Mark would put them between 150 and 160 CE. And here's the kicker. The Gospel of John is typically dated around 40 years after Mark. That would put John at 200 CE. Yeah, it could be that late. So Jesus' ministry is supposed to have ended around 30 CE, and Mark wrote his gospel 40 years later. Now, let's talk about the average lifespan in first century Judea. It was about 30 to 35 years. Now, I know that range is heavily skewed by infant mortality, but it does not change the fact that somebody who was old enough to have met a historical Jesus before he died, have memories of what he said and did, was almost definitely not alive when Mark was writing his gospel. Mark was a fluent speaker and writer of Greek who probably lived in or near Rome. Mark never met anybody that knew Jesus in real life, not even once. He didn't even use the same Bible as Jesus. Jesus would have read the Hebrew Bible in Aramaic or in Hebrew. Mark was working from the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, and it's the source of the mistranslated prophecies that Jesus was supposed to have fulfilled, like the virgin birth. So if we stick with the earliest accepted date for Mark, which is 70 CE, Matthew and Luke are 10 to 20 years later, meaning that whereas Mark is 40 years removed from the events that he talks about, Matthew and Luke are 50 to 60 years removed. It gets even worse for John because the Gospel of John's earliest date is 110 CE, which puts him a full 80 years after the supposed death of Jesus. Interestingly, none of the Gospels claims to have been written by an eyewitness. None of them, with the exception of John, claims to have been written by somebody who spoke to an eyewitness. And in the case of the Gospel of John, John refers to the beloved disciple, but he never tells us what his name is. Isn't that strange? Now, as I said earlier, the gospel writers never claimed to be eyewitnesses to the events that they were narrating. These were not meant to be historical documents. And one of my problems with using the gospels as evidence, quote unquote, for a historical Jesus is that that's not what they're for. These are spiritual documents that are trying to encapsulate eternal spiritual truths in a way that is both easy to communicate and easy to digest. And it's asking way too much of them to be historical sources for whatever kernel of truth may lie at the heart of the myth that has become Jesus, because that's not what they're for.